Abaragani. Good to see you today. Today we're going to be talking about all the books that I've been reading. How do I come across this information? Earth Mama asked me, she says, okay, next week, I want you to talk about your top 10 books. But naturally, because I always overdo things, I couldn't just talk about 10. So you see this list of books here, where I hope we get through this in an hour. I'm just going to give the highlights, the 10,000 foot version of the books, but I'm going to talk about the books that have meaning to me. Now, this, of course, is not an exhausted list of books, but these are some books that I think that could help you in your studies as you want to learn about spirituality, as you want to learn about African history, as you want to learn about our story, istory, in the African experience in this world. So, first book I'm going to talk about is Destruction of Black Civilization by Chancellor Williams. And here is an older picture of Dr. Chancellor Williams. And Dr. Chancellor Williams wrote a couple of books, The Birth of Democracy. But at Wose Community Church, this is the springboard book that we use, that we actually get our name from, Wose, because there is a chapter in Destruction of Black Civilization where Dr. Chancellor Williams is talking about the city of 100 gates, and it's referring to what the Greeks call Thebes, what the Arabs call Luxor and Karnak, and it explains Wose, how it was the center of education, how war chariots, 20,000 war chariots could be dispersed at a moment's notice. Wouldn't you like to be able to do that now as African Americans, to actually to do something to defend ourselves? Anyway, in this book, he has it divided up into two sections. The first section, he deals with 10 city-states, beginning with Ethiopia, Egypt. He goes into the remarkable Mosi. He goes into Songhay and ancient Ghana, and he goes into Queen Anne and Zinga in ancient Angola. And then he has, right in the middle of the book, it has a view from the bridge, where it's like a watchman. He's at the top of a bridge. He looks over on this side, he can see the past. He looks over on the other side, he can see what's coming. And in that section, he has the shape of things to come. And he has actually a blueprint for us African Americans that we could have a nationwide organization. He breaks it down economically, he breaks it down spiritually, he breaks it down educationally. So this is a book, I began reading it in 1976. Dr. Obata Shaka was teaching at San Francisco State, and so he used this book, and at the same time he was using this book also by Sheikh Anta Diop. Sheikh Anta Diop wrote this book, African Origin of Civilization, Myth or Reality. This is actually his PhD thesis. It was denied 2 times. He is from Senegal, and so he was getting his PhD at the Sorbonne in Paris, and it was denied twice. And so the 3rd time he came with other scholars. He came with a boat, they say a truckload of books, and he could not be denied. In this book, African Origin of Civilization, he talks about the African origin of the ancient Egyptian civilization. And then he's able to, because he's a linguist and because he's he has a radiocarbon expertise, he was able to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the ancient Egyptian civilization begins as a black African civilization. So these 2 books, Destruction of Black Civilization and African Origin of Civilization, is where I began. Now, being at San Francisco State, also, there was this great work, and you've heard me talk about it, Stolen Legacy by Dr. George G.M. James, brought out of obscurity by the late Dr. Asa G. Hilliard. Dr. Hilliard was in a president of a historically black college office one day, and he looked on his bookshelf and he saw this book, Stolen Legacy. And he was so impressed by it, he brought it back to the Bay Area, and it was reissued in 1976 by Richardson Press. And what Dr. George M. James is saying in this book is that the philosophy, the so-called philosophy that's Greek, it's not Greek at all, that it actually came from the ancient Egyptians. And he approaches it like a prosecutor. He looks at the early history of the so-called Greek philosophers, and he sees that, you can't really prove their early history. And then he goes and he looks at the milieu, the situation that was going on in Greece at the time, and he shows that it was not compatible with developing philosophy. He goes and looks at Aristotle and says, how could this man possibly write 1,000 books? And then he goes in and he looks at what Rome did and how they destroyed libraries and other places in ancient Kemet and around the world. It's a great book. It's, it's kind of dated, but it's a good springboard. And actually, when people started noticing it in the 90s, they started attacking it. Marian Lifkowitz and others, they started writing books called Not Out of Africa. But the basic premise, even though it's dated, is very good for you early budding African scholars. Now, at WOSE, our main book, one of our main books, so we have 4 basic books. We have Destruction of Black Civilization, we have Stolen Legacy, and we have the Hosea, and we have 2000 Seasons. Now, when we use the Hosea, it is, the title is Selections from the Hosea. And the word Hosea comes down to 2 Kemetic words, hu and sia, which mean authoritative utterance and exceptional insight. Those are the oars on the boat of Ra that guided through all of creation. So this book starts with the book of knowing of creation, books of prayers and sacred praises, books of wise instruction. It goes into the book of the eloquent peasant, which talks about Kunanuk. Kunanuk was a peasant. He was taking his goods to market, and he got accosted by this rich man because one of his animals stepped, like a couple of inches over into his property. They seized his goods, and so he brought his case to court, and there are 9 petitions in there where he's talking about, hey, look, I'm just a poor man, and he's saying all these things on Mott, and the people there were so impressed because this man hadn't been to school, but they were so impressed. Kun Ampu, did I say Kunanu? Because we started out saying Kunanu, but now we've come to Kun Ampu. So they said, hey, they went back to the Purah and said, hey, you know what? You should hear this man talk. And so the Purah said, keep him talking, write everything that he says down, and but make sure that his family is taken care of. And by the end of the story, he's making 9 petitions, each one. He starts out real flattery, and then by the end, he's just at his wit's end because nobody's saying nothing to him. They're just noting what he says. So it's an education in that respect. Books with wise instruction has Ptahhotep, Kajimni, Anai, Ankh-Shishonki, Fibhor, great wise instructional information. Then you have the book of Dialogue with the Soul, and you had the book of Rising Like Ra, and the books of moral narratives, etc. So this is a great book. It is not the end all to be all on the ancient Kemetic texts, but it is a good springboard for you to do further research into the ancient Kemetic texts. Now, this is a great work by, Ayikwe Arma. It's 2,000 Seasons. It's a historical novel, and it likens African people to spring water and the Europeans as the desert. And so it starts out by saying, spring water flowing to the desert where you flow, there is no regeneration. So, I mean, it's very poetically written. When he talks about the Arab invasion, he refers to them as the predators. When he talks about the European invasion, he refers to them as the destroyers. Beautifully written, gives a very good historical poetic analogy of what happened with African people. And basically he said that we did not rely on one of our basic concepts, which was reciprocity, giving, but only to those in whom we receive an equal measure, receiving, but only in those in whom we give an equal measure. And he points out that when the Arabs came, you know, from the desert, he refers also to them as the hollow-eyed beggars, because they came across the desert and they didn't have anything. And we welcomed them, we nourished them, we fed them, and then they turned on us. And the same thing with the Europeans. And so we gave and gave and gave, and others took and took and took. And this is how we need to get back in sync with the rhythms of life, is to have reciprocity, is to have balance. Just think about it. If you're in a relationship with a person and they give and give and give, and you take and take and take, or vice versa, you give and give and give, and that relationship is out of balance. And so he closes, it's about 300 pages, and he closes with, there is no beauty but in relationships. All beauty is in the creator arrangements of the creator. And you know, all ugliness is in the destructor's aims and in their arrangements. And it's a beautiful book. Sometimes it's hard for people to read this, but it's an excellent work. Ayikwe Arma visited Wose in 1990. He was a little bit put off. Firstly, he was a visiting professor. He was at UC Berkeley, and he was teaching Medu Netre. And when we approached him, Minister Makalisi and Baba Gregg and others approached him and let him know that, okay, there's this religious movement that is using your book as a holy book. You know, he was a little bit apprehensive, but then when he talked to us, he understood, and he came and he spoke at our anniversary in 1990. Great person. He has a publishing company called Per Ankh, or House of Life. He's living in Ghana. Today he is a Ghanaian, and just a great brother. He's written other books. The Beautiful Ones Aren't Born Yet, The Eloquence of the Scribe, and other such books. But we focused on this one, 2,000 Seasons. So get it. And here, this picture has like an original copy. And of course, as books go on, they change the covers. So we talked about that one. Now, shake out to Jope. Now, in our English pronunciation, we say Diop, but I understand that the correct pronunciation is Jope.
That was your first book?
That was, I'm sorry?
The first book you shared was the Origins of African Civilization?
Actually, it was in conjunction with this book.
Okay.
So, you know, I read them together.
Okay.
You know, and I first heard about this book while listening to the Match Line of Brother Khalid Abdullah Tariq El Mansour show on radio station KDIA, Lucky 13. So that was when we used to have real soul stations. And, you know, the talk shows would be very insightful. And a brother called in and he mentioned this book. And I was trying to find it. I didn't know about Marcus Bookstore then. And I never could find it until I got to San Francisco State. And here there was Dr. Obitashaka actually teaching a class with this book. So Jope is very important. He wrote this book. He wrote Cultural Unity of Black Africa. That, you know, it's just not a bunch of countries there and a bunch of languages, but he shows that there's a cultural unity among African people, African nature, African nations, different tribes, you know, based on kinship, we have generally a matrilineal society, sometimes going into a matriarchal society. Also, he talks about the different languages and how they are associated and how they're. So he did a lot of research. So if you want to find the interconnection of cultures and societies on the African continent, this is your book, Cultural Unity of Black Africa. Now he also has a book. He wrote voluminously. I'm glad I was able to say that word. Sometimes I can't say. He wrote voluminously. He wrote Pre-Colonial Black Africa, that we need to know what was going on the continent before we were invaded. What kind of civilization did we have? How did we interact? What was it, an egalitarian civilization? Yes, it was. Was it based upon reciprocity? What was the position of women? How were children educated? These questions are addressed, and many others, in the book Pre-Colonial Black Africa. Now, he also wrote a book called Black Africa, the Economic and Cultural Basis for a Federal State. So he wrote a book on how we could successfully have a United States of Africa. I'm for the USA, the United States of Africa. And people are beginning to do that and bringing that together now. Some good things are actually occurring on the African continent with the African Union, etc. So Job, studies, the climate. For instance, he points out in the Sudan that the Sudan, okay, now it's North and South Sudan, now it's not one country, but in that area alone, the way that the climate is, you could feed the whole continent just from the crops that could be grown in the Sudan. He addresses thermonuclear energy. He addresses hydraulic energy. He addresses wind energy. He addresses solar energy. He divides the continent up into 3 basic areas so that we could use different languages, we would be in a particular area. So this is a great work, Black Africa, the economic and cultural basis of a federal state. We don't have to, reinvent the wheel. That these books are already in print, and then we can look at them and we can read them, and if need be, improve on the information that we have now. Because this book was written in the 70s. But Sheikh Anta Diop is a great African scholar. He's known as the pharaoh of African-centered thought. Now, one of his seminal works is this work called Civilization or Barbarism. For a long time, all you could do is get it in French, but finally, through the powers of the Most High, Sheikh Anta Diop, I believe Dr. Leonard Jeffries had something to do with this coming out. We were able to get this in English form, and he addresses, African interaction with other cultures, particularly the Greek culture, the Minoan culture, the Aegean culture. He addresses a pet project of mine, which is Atlantis, and he ties it up to the island of Santorini, and he really outdid himself. This book is like about 600 or 700 pages. Can't go into it today, all of it into it today, but let me just tell you, if you're interested in African-centered thought, this is one of the books that you need to get. Civilization or Barbarism by Sheikh Anta Diop. All right, now Dr. Ivan Van Sertima livicated a book to him entitled Great African Thinkers, and it's so it has all of his papers, things that he thought about, his scientific experiments. One of the things that he did, he was finally able to get a piece of the skin of the Ramessu II. And what he found when he did the melanin dosage test was that he found out that Ramessu had more melanin than he did, an unmixed Senegalese African. And so he developed the melanin dosage test, and what he found out was that the European scholars that he was always debating with, they already knew about the quality of melanin in the mummies, even before he did. Anyway, it's great if you want to deal and focus on Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop. This is the book that you need to read, Great African Thinkers, edited by the late, great Dr. Ivan Van Sertima. All right, one of his proteges, and I mention him every time I talk, is Dr. Dr. Theophile Obenga. Dr. Obenga is from the Congo, speaks about 17 different languages, is fluent in probably about 12. Don't hold me on those exact numbers, but he has a plethora of knowledge on linguistics, and so he was Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop's protege. And when they went to the UNESCO conference, him and Dr. Diop settled once and for all the African origin of ancient Egyptian civilization, because again, they brought a truckload of books. So he wrote this book, African Philosophy, the Pharaonic Period, 2780 to 300 BC. He addresses so many things. Looks at the hymn to Aton, which is really what he shows is a scientific work. It's not just a religious hymn, but it's actually explaining, looking at, because it says that you develop the seed in the woman, that, it deals with the photosynthesis. So he's looking at it from a scientific view. He's looking at it from what a scribe is, and how the scribe was taught to love knowledge, to love wisdom. This is another great work that you need to check out. African Philosophy, the Pharaonic Period by Theophile Obenga. And this is a really good one. Then this is a short one. This book here, it's like about 300 or 400 pages. But this one, Ancient Egypt and Black Africa, is a really good book. And I like what he says about philosophy, and he points out how philosophy is not a Greek word, and he shows the connection between the word Sophia, which means wisdom, and the word Seba, which is what the ancient teachers in Kemet were referred to as. He breaks down so many things. It's like a workbook, and then he has like little questions for you to address at the end of each chapter. So this is a great book. And unfortunately, with the advent of Amazon and other places, some of these books that used to be like $20, you go, they're asking like $167 or something like that. So you got to shop around to get the best price for these books. All right, now I'm going to go to the Journal of African Civilizations. The Journal of African Civilization, as put together by the great scholar from Rutgers University, Dr. Ivan Van Sertima. Ivan Van Sertima is started out being known for writing the book They Came Before Columbus, which talks about the African presence in ancient America. And he did a fantastic job. And then he put together the Journal of African Civilization. And this is the first book that came out, I believe. It's called Nile Valley Civilization. This book is out of print. When I was preparing for today, and I seized this picture, and I looked on eBay. They're asking like, $100 and some for it. So this book, Nile Valley Contribution to Civilization, it's actually a collector's item, but it actually talks about what's going on in the Nile Valley, its presence, its scientific developments, from watercraft to astronomy to language to mathematics, etc. So it's a great book. And moving on, this is a really great book. I know I keep saying that, but they all are. So Egypt Revisited, again, another very well refereed, well scholarly work. It's not only Ivan Van Sertima, but he brings together a lot of different scholars to put these books together. Two of his proteges, Wayne Chandler and Runoko Rashidi. He brings together other scholars. Sometimes he'll have like Dr. Asa Hilliard. Sometimes he'll have Lynn Jeffries, his wife Rosalind Jeffries, and other scholars that he's put together. And he really critiques these. He gives a really good introduction at the beginning, so you kind of know what you're getting. And then each book. There's one article that comes to mind is one by Dr. Charles Finch. Dr. Charles Finch is a medical doctor, and he does a whole thing on medical terms in ancient Kemet, and actually goes into the Kemetic terms of parts of the body, parts of the skull. And so it's a fantastic work. Get this book, Ancient Egypt or Egypt Revisited. Now this is a great one. This one is one of the few ones, I think, when Van Sertima was alive. African presence in early Asia. And right here on the cover is this picture of Krishna. And Krishna is one of the avatars of Vishnu. So within the pantheon, you have Brahma, the creator, you have Vishnu, the preserver, and you have Shiva, which is the resolver. Some people say the destroyer. But here we see him here in his blackness. There's a heavenly scene of this. I'm sorry, it's not clear. And then underneath you have Arjuna and the Pandavas. In those early times, they were portrayed as black people because they were. I mean, that kind of settles it for me. So we're not talking about a painting or tapestry. We're talking about stuff that's carved in stone. So great work, and this is edited by Runoko Rashidi. The Runoko did a lot of traveling in India, finding out about the African presence in early India and other places. They deal with Arabia. They deal with Cambodia, a whole lot of things. And when you go back and you go like to a place called Angkor Wat, you see the great city of Angkor Wat. And right when you come in, there's these huge Africoid statues. And so they talk about them. And this is a great work.
So who was this book by?
So this is all part of the Journal of African Civilizations. It's really put together by Runoko Rashidi because he has a large, great expertise on African presence in early Asia, and is co-edited by Ivan Van Sertima because it's part of his Journal of African Civilizations. Okay. Now, continuing the Journal of African Civilizations, Black Women of Antiquity deals with Hatshepsut, one of the world's first king-queens, deals with Queen Tai, the mother of Akhenaten, deals with, Nefertiti. Most people, the way that Nefertiti is portrayed, she looks like a white woman, but that's only like one or two statues, and the origin of them is very dubious. The other statues, she just has one of those long heads like her husband, Akhenaten. Anyway, deals with all, Queen Anne and Nzinga, deals with, great women, deals with the queens of Ethiopia called the Cantakes, which we know them generally as by the name Candace. Deals with the Queen of Sheba, deals with so many different things. There's articles in here by Rosalind Jeffries, the wife of Dr. Leonard Jeffries. Great works in here by John Heinrich Clark and others. And so if you want to find out about Black Women of Antiquity, get this Journal of African Civilization by Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, and you will not be disappointed. Continuing on, Egypt, Child of Africa, deals with, most people say that, it was Egypt first and then Africa came after, but actually the civilization begins at the origin of the Nile. And the Nile has had various different flows over time. And in some part, the Nile is actually connected to the Niger. But that part is under the sand now. But anyway, he goes into many different aspects of Ethiopia, the Sudan, Nubia being the origin of the civilization that flourished at the end of the Nile in the place that is now referred to as Egypt. It's a great work. Goes into the Per-Oz, articles by Wayne Chandler, articles by Runoko Rashidi, articles by Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, articles done by a lot of great scholars, and I'm just going to keep moving on. Golden Age of the Moors. Now, I hate to say this, and I know some of my close friends are like this, and I don't want to insult them in any way, but I actually have a problem now. We're not Africans anymore. We're now Moors, and they actually take little pieces from works that are put together by Ivan Van Sertima to develop their philosophy. And it's a free country. You can do that. But I think really to know about the ancient Moors beginning in 710, when General Tariq leads Moors in from North Africa across the Straits of Gibraltar into Spain, Portugal, and southern France, ruled that area for 700 years, from 711 AD to 1491 AD, bringing Europe out of the Dark Ages, reintroducing culture, civilization, even such things as the daily bath, because Europeans looked at bathing as rank infidelity. You had nuns that were bragging about the fact that the only water that touched their body was when they put their finger in to go into church for holy water, so they were just stinking underneath those robes. It was the Moors who brought in civilization. There were the Garamanti Moors. There were Moors from Senegal. And because it was an Arabic civilization and influence, they brought in cultures from all over the world: India, China, Egypt, Africa. The first university in Europe is the University of Salamanca in Spain, which was a copy of the University of Genet in ancient Mali. You've heard of Timbuktu, from here to Timbuktu. That was a central university city, people coming as far away from China. So in that at that place at the University of Genet in ancient Timbuktu, you had the first successful surgical operation on the cataract on the human eye to take place. So all of these things and more are covered in this golden age of the Moor. All right, another great work, Blacks in Science, Ancient and Modern. He deals with Imhotep. He deals with people in Tanzania who they had an ancient smelting process, which was a semiconductor style of smelting iron, that they had centrifuges that got 8,000 degrees centigrade. And okay, this is not new now, but back in those ancient times, Europe didn't start getting those type of ovens until like the late 1800s. Goes into Imhotep, goes into Lewis Latimer, goes into so many inventions, inventors, creators, discoverers, both ancient and modern. This is a great book. So, you know, like sometimes if you're trying to prep for, you know, February, some of us are only concerned about African history or Black history in February. If you need to, like, if you want to look at something, you know, kind of quickly but in depth, this is your book, Blacks in Science, Ancient and Modern. Now, I think for me, this is probably the best, this book here, Exploding Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization by Anthony Browder. This is probably your best bang for your buck because he goes into so many different things. He looks at it from a Masonic standpoint. He talks about how when they discovered mummies, they used to grind them up into mummy dust and consume them for aphrodisiacs. He opens up the books with quotes from people we thought were on our side, but they refer, you know, so he's quoting like Benjamin Franklin, and he's quoting like Lincoln, and he's quoting Toynbee, and he's quoting so-called great European scholars that said that we contributed nothing to civilization. And then he proceeds to spell out in a very methodic, chronological way the African contributions to Nile Valley. And it's called Exploding the Myths. Spends a lot of time with the Masonic, the African origin of Masonic orders, etc. So I would say if you're going to, of all these books, the best bang for your buck, and I want you to know, I do not get any residuals from Anthony Browder, although when he first released this book, it was in 1993. It had just been a couple of weeks. He came to Wose and presented it. Right now, he's doing great works right there in Kemet and Nubia. He's restoring a site in Nubia, and he's livicating it to the great scholar, Dr. Asa G. Hilliard. So bravo for him. And he's working with his daughter, Atlantis, with it. And so, hey, get this book if you just want to, some place to start. Of all the books that we mentioned, this is a great place to start. I really like what he did with this. And then there's a workbook. Let's see, did I include that in here? I did not. But there's also a companion workbook with this book. Now, one of the few books that is written how to read and write the Medu Neter or the Suf language, or you know, whatever you want to call it, the hieroglyphics. This is it's called Let the Ancestors Speak, and it has a foreword in it by Dr. Theophia Obenga. I had a conversation with Brother Wayne Chandler one time, and he said he was in a room, and this guy was talking to this before the book came out. And this guy was talking to Dr. Obenga, and they were speaking in French, and so Wayne was just able to just observe, and he said Obenga was just listening, and he was just listening very intently, and he would every now and then he would say we, and then he would say we. You know, he was just so excited about this book. This is a great book to tell you how to put together, conjugate verbs, how to look at the Medu Neter, the Suf language, and there's a reason why I say Suf, and I'll get to that later. So this is a great work. Let the Ancestors Speak. All right, now, one of the early works, and you know, this is a book that my mother read. This was a book in 1933. It's called The Miseducation of the Negro by Carter G. Woodson. And this is my first copy. This is you know, now if you look at it, there's various different covers, but this, and I like this one because it has a black person with a blindfold on. And that's actually how we're proceeding through life, through this civilization. And so this is a great work. Dr. Carter G. Woodson spent his life in education. He taught us. He had to work in a coal mine. He finished high school in his early 20s. went on to become a teacher, went on to become a supervisor of education in the Philippines, came back, was an educator in the Washington, D.C. school district, an educator at Howard University. And so he has chapters in here. Failure to make a living. Just basic things that he observed. This book was written in 1933. And of course it has that famous quote about black people not having to be told to go to the back door, but because of the education that they will cut one. And if there's not a back door, excuse me, if you don't have to tell them to go to the back door, they'll go there, and if it's not one, they'll cut one. Wow. And how many times, sisters and brothers, have you met people like that? That they just automatically go to their place. And if they can't find it, they'll cut a place for them. It's kind of sad, but this is great work. When my son took the historically black college tour, this was required reading that they gave to all of the students, that they had to read Miseducation of the Negro. All right, the famous ISIS papers. Dr. Frances Cress Welsing. This book is a compilation of various papers beginning in 1969 with the Cress theory of color confrontation. She has chapters in here called the MF and the original MF. Justifiable homicide. It's chapter 15 in this book. As a matter of fact, a lot of times when I'm looking at police brutality or something, I automatically open up this book and turn to chapter 15. She goes into, because she's a child psychologist, she looks at things. She has a book called On Ball Games. She points out how the game of billiards, it has all the colored balls on the table and one white ball knocking all the colored balls off the table, and the last ball is the black ball, and the only ball remaining on the table is the white ball. She looks into the psychiatry of that. She has a book on guns, and shows how, like a handgun, and when you compare it to a male genitalia, it looks the same. She breaks down a whole lot of things in here. The ISIS papers. I hate that the terrorist organization that call themselves ISIS, but she puts in here, she calls the book ISIS, The Keys to the Colors. And right here she has it right here in the Medu Neter, the glyphs for Aset, which the Greeks called Isis. Must reading. There was a man from Jamaica, actually from Negril, Jamaica, by the name of Joel A. Rogers. He wrote many great works. World's Great Men of Color, Volume 1 and 2. Volume 1 deals with the so-called old world. Volume 2 deals with the new world. It has everybody in there. Everybody that's anybody in African history are in these books. Some you may have never heard of. I would wager that many of the ones in this book have never heard. It's very well refereed and cited. So, but it has like little thumbnail sketches on people like Tutmosis III, Akhenaten, the Queen of Sheba, Lukman, Aesop, Imhotep, and goes into the New World, and so it's a great book. He also wrote Nature Knows No Color Line. He investigates where black people are, and this person that's on here, she was like a princess in England. So what's the sister that married the prince?
Megan something.
Yeah, well, she's not the first one. All right. He also wrote this book, Sex and Race. So Nature Knows No Color Line is volume 1 and 2. And then he wrote this book, Sex and Race. And you know what? What sells on the news is always about sex and race. So this is J.A. Rogers.
Okay,
yeah. Volumes 1, 2, and 3. I mean, he investigates so many different things. He looks at black people in Germany. He looks at black people in Italy. He looks at the Moors. He has written so many books, and I actually didn't put all of his books. He has written so many, but Sex and Race is another important one. Now, this is a book that really helped me in my development, by Dr. Yosef Ben Yankinen, affectionately called Dr. Ben. It's called The Black Man of the Nile and His Family. And Dr. Ben wrote many books: African Origin, a Major Western Religion, Are Black Seminarians Without a Black Theology, Cultural Genocide in the African Studies Curriculum, They All Look Alike. So Dr. Ben, he was a visible, dynamic spokesperson for African-centered movement in the 70s and 80s, going into the 90s. He took a lot of people to Kemet, including myself. Look him up. His speeches are great, and this is very important work. Black Man of the Nile and His Family. Now, moving on, if you want to find out how Europe underdeveloped Africa, this book was written by a Guyanese brother by the name of Walter Rodney, and he talks about how, so why is Africa like it is now? Because they took all the wealth, or much of the wealth, out of the continent, ripped it out, ripped out the people, ripped out the resources, and the parasitic relationship that is still in existence today. This is a great work by Walter Rodney. The reggae artist Linton Kwesi Johnson actually has a song to Walter Rodney. This great work. Also, a companion work to this is Capitalism and Slavery. That you would not have the riches that are in Europe and in America without the triangular slave trade, and how those riches were accumulated, and how, free labor for 400 years. So these two works, if you want to get information on what happened, what's going on now, even though they're kind of dated. All right. Capitalism and Slavery by Eric Williams. Now, this is one of my main go-to books. Man, God, and Civilization, written by John G. Jackson. I got a chance to meet John G. Jackson in 1984 at the first ASCAC conference at Compton College. He goes from one end of the world to the next. He talks about the Americas. He talks about Egypt. He talks about Ethiopia. He goes into the astronomical aspects of it. Wrote so much. He put so much in this book. Man, God, and Civilization. And it's concise enough that you can pick up something. You can just do one chapter and gain a lot of information from it. Again, it's well referenced, well researched. And he also wrote this book, Christianity Before Christ. That's right. Christianity Before Christ. Now, in those early days, the only people that would come and listen to John G. Jackson were atheists, because he was talking about the origins of Christianity, using in some of his reference books, Kersey Graves' book, The 16 Crucified Saviors. So if you want to know about Christianity Before Christ, it's very controversial for those of us that, just don't want to learn anything else outside the Bible. For those of you that do, Christianity Before Christ is great work. All right. Now, I found this book, and I actually communicated with the author a little bit. The Africans Who Wrote the Bible. Africans wrote the Bible. What does he say about it? He says, the people that left ancient Egypt in the so-called biblical Exodus were ancient Egyptians. Specifically, they were mostly Akan people joined by other African tribes. Oh, yes, Brother Ben Ofari needs to check this book out. My friend Ben Ofari, because he's from Ghana. This brother that wrote it is from Ghana. He breaks it down. So basically what he says is that the ancient Egyptians were Akan people. And the way he does it is through language. It's fantastic. It's a great read. And we used to give classes at WOSE on this book. We used to go through this book in its entirety. The Africans Who Wrote the Bible. It's a great book. All right. Now, getting on a spiritual tip, I was in the bookstore, Shambhala bookstore one day. This is in Berkeley. It's no longer there. This was a great metaphysical bookstore on Telegraph. And I saw an old friend, an old classmate by the name of Ron. I can't think of Ron's last name, but we hadn't seen each other in a while, and we were talking in the bookstore, and I was looking for books to buy. And he suggested that I read this book, Autobiography of a Yogi, by Pahamsa Yogananda. And Yogananda was he was the second person to bring yoga into the United States. The first person was Vivekananda, but he was the second one, and he formed an organization called the Self-Realization Fellowship. Now, what got me to read this book is because Ron, he opened up the book, and on the last few pages, the funeral director is talking about how when Yogananda, so people that are self-realized, they're able to leave their body. They don't just die, they leave their body. And it's called Maha Samadhi. And so he Maha Samadhi in 1957, and he left his body there, and it did not show any decay or any kind of mold for 2 weeks. And there's a letter to that effect written by the funeral director on that. So that made me want to check this out. Now, I was reading this book simultaneously with the book Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. And while I was reading this, and I was going with this girl that later became my wife, and she was studying engineering, and she was having a difficult time understanding the whole physics concept. She read chapter 33 in this book, which deals with miracles, and the light came on for her to understanding physics. This is such a great work. It's a lot of fantastic things. You know, it stretches the credulity of imagination, but it's a very spiritual book, and I think those of you that would want to get into it, it's also on tape. You can actually hear this book being read by Yogananda in his voice himself. He was very, there's also a movie out about Yogananda. It's called The Awakening. Also, moving on, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, this book here, How to Know God, one of the basics for understanding meditation, spirituality. It has 4 chapters. They're aphorisms, but after each aphorism, there's a good explanation of what he's saying. I highly recommend this book. All right, my dear friend Wayne Chandler, my sons know him as Uncle Wayne. They refer to him as Uncle Wayne because every time Wayne comes in town, we hang out. And I mean, he's such an accomplished scholar. He's an anthrophotojournalist, protege of Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, really close friends with Renoka Rashidi. And he put together this book, Ancient Future, that's based upon the Kabbalion, and dealing with the conversation between Hermes, or Thoth, or Tahuti, and Esculapius, or Imhotep. And he has the different chapters on vibration, on various things, and he puts together a lot of things in this book, connecting the Odu Ifa with the I Ching in China, which extends to the genetic code, the 64 code. So Wayne is very heavy, and this is a profound work, and he's done his research, and a lot of people rave about this book. I rave about this book, Ancient Future. All right, now I'm getting to a close. So I found this book is called Exiled Egyptians, and it's by Mustafa Gadalia, and he's actually an Egyptian. And what he's saying in this book is that the ancient Egyptians, when Arabs and you know, when different people invaded. So Egypt was invaded by Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, Turks. And during those invasions, a lot of the people just went further south. And so they still were able to carry on a remnant of their culture. And you can find them, just as an example, in Nigeria. There's a river that is named called the Benue River. Well, those of you that are familiar with the ancient Kemetic traditions know that the Benue bird is the origin of the phoenix bird that rises out of the ashes. You know, and so he explains a lot of things in this book. If you go to his website, he actually has a course. You can actually get a master's course and a bachelor's course dealing with all the things that he wrote about. He has a very, again, he's very prolific in his writing, and I enjoy his work a lot. Some people have problems with it, but I'm talking about me. So these are books that I like. All right, now, just recently, in the last couple of years, I started studying the Pyramid Code. It's in a 5-part series, and within that Pyramid Code, there was Abdel Hakim Awiyan in there, an indigenous wisdom keeper. And as I probed further, I found out that this brother, you know, he's a Jewish brother, but he's like one of these blue-eyed soul brothers. I mean, he knows a lot about African culture, African history, and you know, hung out with a lot of brothers. Anyway, he wrote this book called Land of Osiris, based upon the teachings of Abdel Hakim Awiyan. It's a new paradigm, a different paradigm, which talks about not going back to 3,500 or 3,400 or 3,000, actually going to 54,000 BC. The statue that we call the Sphinx is actually a woman by the name of Tefnuti. Here she is behind me here.
Wow.
She's actually a woman. The Perneters, or the pyramids, were built 20,000 years. A lot of great teachings in this. Deals with an area called Boo Wizard, or the Land of Osiris. It's a 2,500 square mile area, including Dashur, Giza, Saqqara, Abu Shur. That these areas are set up for harmonic resonance, and frequency. And, you know, it just gives you a plethora of knowledge and information. So this is one of the books that I enjoy rereading over and over again. You know, I started out, you know, with a little bit of knowledge, and now I'm gaining more and more. And just this past September, I was able to accompany Stephen Mailer and others so now they pronounce Kemet with a K, Khemet. So they refer to Kemet or Cometian, where most African-centered people, they say Kemetic. Anyway, it is information that is worth evaluating, observing, plumbing the depths, not just dealing with, okay, black people were the first people to do this thing, but actually going into the science, you know, how these things were constructed. So he refers to it as peeling back the onion. So you have the Christian onion, you have the Arab onion, you have the Christian onion, you have the Greek onion, you have the Persian onion, you have the Assyrian onion, you have the dynastic onion, and then you have the pre-dynastic onion. And many of the monuments that we look at and we marvel how that they got there, those are actually pre-dynastic. And you know, so there's a lot to this. I can't get into it all. I want to livicate a program to this, and maybe we can call in to Stephen, and maybe he'll come in and explain some of his works. He's told me that he would do it in the past. And lastly, he wrote this book, From Light to Darkness, that actually, in the very ancient time, people were enlightened, that they were operating on 360 senses. But because of a shift in time and space, that we're now limited and crippled to 5 senses. Great book, and you know, it goes into Akhenaten, goes into who the Hebrews were, and you know, another well referenced. It's on the fringe, but I think it's a work that we need to check out if we're going to expand our knowledge, wisdom, and understanding in this whole thing called history or history or the Kemetic culture. Well, Earth Mama, I think that's it. I don't know if I went over time.
38 books. That's very good.
All right. 38 books?
38 books.
38 books. See, she
Awesome.
tried to get me down to 10.
No, no such thing as 10 books.
But, you know, some I like, and this is not an exhausted list. I have other books, but, you know, I don't know how much time you have to sit here and hear me chat about these books. So I hope that something was said that make you want to go in and purchase these books, read them, study them, imbibe them, assimilate them. As I'm saying that, Stolen Legacy, we have the 10 virtues that are in Stolen Legacy. It says control of thought, control of action, steadfastness of purpose, faith in the ability of the master to teach you the truth, faith in your ability to assimilate the truth, faith in your ability to wield the truth, freedom from resentment under the experience of persecution, freedom from resentment under the experience of wrongdoing, cultivate the ability to tell right from wrong, cultivate the ability to tell the real from the unreal. And so that's what I continually striving to do, cultivate the ability to tell the real from the unreal. This has been Papa Al Kabelan on the Earth Mama channel. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope something that we said was valuable to you. Ankh Ujab Sanev, life, prosperity, and health. Live up.